So apparently, I'm carrying around a bunch of dad vibes nowadays. I'm actually one of those dudes that walks around with like some OG beat up Vans and some really long socks. I don't know, that's just something that randomly happened. I've always been like an ankle sock type of guy, but yeah, I literally wore socks the other day that were almost up to my knee. The crazy part about all of this is I'm not ashamed. I'm just gonna accept it. I've got the dad vibes going on, and that's just the way that it's going to be from now on. But anyways, all jokes aside, we're not here to talk about really long, extensive dad socks. We're actually here to talk about a brand new day, and I wanted to give you guys my personal take, my perspective on what the expectations are for a brand new day and whether it will be able to fulfill those expectations. Now, before we get into it, there are some, I think, minor problems regarding a brand new day's release, and a lot of that has to do with the collapse that has been happening at Disney or at Marvel. A lot of the previous projects that they've released have not been incredibly successful. You can go back to like the Marvels, which was an absolute catastrophic failure. They lost a ton of money. Same thing with the latest Ant-Man entry into the MCU. Now, there were a couple of other projects that came later, and I'm referring to Fantastic Four and Thunderbolts, which, according to multiple different sources, they either barely broke even or lost a few $1 million, and that's just not a very good look for Marvel as a whole. So, obviously, the MCU is carrying over that baggage onto a brand new day, and the expectations are set incredibly high. Now, the real question is whether this film will flop, and I guess it depends on your definition of the word flop, because a lot of people have been throwing that phrase around for quite some time. Look, movies sometimes get released and break even or lose a little bit of money, but then they find a little bit of a second wind. Maybe the merchandising does incredibly well. Back in the day, DVD sales could, account for some of the profits, but now you have streaming services to kind of work as a little bit of a safety net in case a movie doesn't do incredibly well at the movie theaters. They always have streaming services to kind of kick in a little bit extra. In this particular case, Disney already has Disney Plus, which has always been kind of a little bit of a safety net within the company, where if a film doesn't do great there, they can just kind of backfill some of the losses from the Disney Plus subscriptions. I think it is important to take a look back at some of the entries into the Spider-Man MCU franchise thus far. For example, you have Spider-Man Homecoming, which came out in 2017 and made a grand total of just under $900 million. Now, obviously, you have to take a lot of things into consideration, inflation, things of that nature. This movie is at the moment almost about like 9 years old. So obviously, if it were released, or if you were to account for that money in today's standards, it probably would hit closer to $1 billion. But still, $900 million, it was incredibly successful, and it was very well received. The second entry into the Spider-Man MCU franchise was Spider-Man Far From Home, which came out in 2019 and made just under $1.2 billion. It was the first Spider-Man movie to be able to break that $1 billion mark. Not to mention, it is the 10th all-time top grossing MCU movie up to this point. And then you have Spider-Man No Way Home, which came out in 2021, and it would be able to make about $1.9 billion at the box office. What's really interesting about this is that there are only two MCU movies that are above Spider-Man No Way Home. You have Avengers Endgame and Infinity War. Avengers Infinity War would actually go on to make a little over $2 billion, and then Endgame would be able to rack up a grand total of $2.8 billion. So the fact that Spider-Man is in the top 3 for top grossing MCU movies of all time is absolutely mind-blowing, because if you really put Spider-Man in the grander scheme of things here, he isn't really one of the more intriguing pieces of the MCU. Like, you could make the argument that Captain America, Thor, Iron Man, all of these other characters are way more pivotal to the larger scheme of the MCU. So just kind of interesting that regardless of how important he is to the grander role or the grander storyline, the film franchise still makes a ton of money. In this particular case, it is the third most grossing MCU movie. So it just goes to show that Spider-Man is definitely easily the most popular character in the Marvel universe. However, going forward, that is a huge standard that they've set for themselves. And so now a brand new day, is expected to make more money, or at least projected to make more money than No Way Home. However, in my personal opinion, I wouldn't be so sure of that. I'm not sitting here and telling you guys that I'm predicting it's going to make less than that $1.9 billion, but the MCU is definitely not in the same position that it was way back in the day. This film was riding incredibly high after Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, which were absolutely massively popular. And I'm not necessarily knocking the overall plot or the acting or any of the actors. I think this is going to be a very grounded, very realistic take on the Spider-Man franchise. And I think that Tom Holland's character is going to go through an incredible transition here. It's going to have some incredible narrative plot lines. And honestly, it looks like it could potentially be my favorite Spider-Man movie coming from the MCU. However, because of the situation, because of the era that we live in, where people are just not as interested in comic book films, I do feel like they may be up against it. Let's not forget the Superman movie just recently released from James Gunn, who was a huge part of the MCU. And that movie, a lot of people consider to be a gigantic flop. It was only able to make like $500 million at the box office. And that is coming from, again, a very popular director in James Gunn, a very popular character in Superman. And yet somehow people were just not interested in going to watch a live action Superman. And I feel like that's just the consensus of like the community as a whole. I don't think people are that interested in comic book films or comic book based films the way that they were like 5-6 years ago. So, a brand new day is definitely coming into a brand new era. And unfortunately, I don't think that that's necessarily going to bode as well for this film. Now, I don't think it's going to flop. I don't think it's going to go out there and flounder and, not even be able to hit $1 billion. The projected budget for this movie is going to be about $500 million, which means it would have to make more than $500 million, in total. I personally believe that it will probably make that just in its first week or within the first couple of weeks, but I don't necessarily feel it's going to break all of those records. Maybe Avengers Doomsday comes in and surprises us just a little bit, but a brand new day just is coming into a very decimated Marvel Cinematic Universe that just doesn't have the same staying power as they initially had. And so I feel like it's in a little bit of a decline. I don't necessarily feel like it's going to struggle. I don't feel like they're going to lose any money on this project, but I don't feel like it's going to necessarily hit the projections that a lot of these so-called experts are predicting. A lot of people say this is going to hit well over $2 billion, and I could be wrong, but I feel like this is going to fall somewhere in the middle. I don't feel it's going to be as popular. I don't feel it's going to make as much money as No Way Home. It will definitely make a little bit more than Far From Home, which, as I said, made just a little bit over $1.1 billion. So I'm assuming it's going to fall in between No Way Home and Far From Home. And again, most of us will consider that to be like an absolutely insane, massive, successful launch. But by Marvel standards, especially the way that they've been carrying the weight for a lot of the previous entries into the MCU, I think they're going to be a little bit frustrated and maybe they go in a completely different direction, which I'm hoping that they don't, because I actually like where they're taking the Spider-Man MCU franchise. I feel like it's getting more grounded. I feel like it's going to be way more about the storytelling, way more about character progression. And unfortunately, I feel like the first 3 films really lack that. And I honestly enjoyed. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what Marvel does next with this Tom Holland MCU Spider-Man franchise. But as always, this is just my personal opinion. I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say. Do you guys feel like this particular film will be a massive disappointment? Will it be an incredible success story? I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say. Let me know down below in the comment section. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Make sure to stay safe out there. Go ahead, read a comic book, watch a movie, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.